She had no idea she was about to learn the most expensive lesson of her career, right in front of the people she was trying to impress. The annual charity fundraiser at Morrison Associates was supposed to be an elegant evening of networking and giving back to the community. My sister Rebecca had spent weeks talking about how important this event was for her career as a junior associate at one of the city's most prestigious law firms. What she didn't expect was for her older brother, me, to show up wearing a simple polo shirt and khakis, looking completely out of place among the sea of designer suits and cocktail dresses. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me. Rebecca had always been the ambitious one in the family, the one who talked about making it big in corporate law. She graduated from an Ivy League school with honors, landed this coveted position at Morrison Associates, and never let anyone forget it. Meanwhile, I was just her older brother who'd taken the long road through life. Military service, night school, and what she dismissively called my small-town legal practice. At 45, I'd learned to appreciate life's simple pleasures. After serving 2 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine Corps officer, and then working my way through law school on the GI Bill, I preferred quiet evenings at home with a good book over fancy social events. My gray hair was starting to show at the temples, and the lines around my eyes told stories of sleepless nights in combat zones and long hours studying case law by lamplight. My hands, weathered from years of military service and later from the countless hours I'd spent renovating my small law office, stood in stark contrast to the manicured fingers of the attorneys around me. Tonight I'd only come because Rebecca had specifically invited me, saying she wanted to introduce me to some people who might help with my little legal practice. Her tone had been patronizing, but I'd accepted anyway. Family was family, even when they didn't quite understand your choices. The truth was, I'd built something meaningful over the past decade. My practice focused on helping veterans navigate the legal system, pro bono work for struggling families, and cases that the big firms wouldn't touch because the profit margins weren't high enough. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Rebecca had never quite grasped that concept. Morrison Associates had transformed their downtown office building's top floor into an elegant venue. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables laden with silent auction items, vacations to exotic locations, artwork from local galleries, and dinner packages at restaurants that charged more for a single meal than most people made in a day. Attorneys in expensive suits mingled with judges, city officials, and wealthy clients, their conversations a careful dance of professional networking and social positioning. The view of the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows was breathtaking. Soft jazz played in the background as servers in crisp white uniforms offered champagne and hors d'oeuvre to the distinguished guests. Everything about the evening screamed prestige and success, the kind of success that Rebecca had always dreamed of and that she assumed I'd never achieve. I recognized many faces in the crowd, judges I'd appeared before, attorneys I'd worked with on various cases, and city officials I'd encountered in my practice. What struck me was how differently they all seemed to perceive this gathering compared to how Rebecca did. For her, this was the pinnacle of professional achievement. For many others, it was just another Tuesday evening obligation. As I moved through the crowd, I noticed several people do double takes when they saw me. Judge Patricia Chen, whom I'd known for years through various legal proceedings, gave me a respectful nod from across the room. Her expression suggested she was as surprised as I was to see the other in this particular setting. City Attorney Michael Rodriguez paused mid-conversation with his wife to wave in my direction, his eyebrows raised in what looked like amused recognition. Senior partner Margaret Morrison herself had greeted me warmly at the door, though she seemed surprised to see me at what she called a more casual gathering. Her handshake had been firm, professional, and tinged with something that looked almost like deference. I kept my interactions brief and polite, preferring to observe rather than socialize. Years of military training and courtroom experience had taught me the value of watching and listening before speaking. What I found interesting was how the younger associates seemed oblivious to these subtle interactions. They were too focused on impressing each other and the senior partners to notice the quiet conversations happening around them. Rebecca's group in particular seemed absorbed in their own little bubble of ambition and office politics. Rebecca spotted me near the silent auction tables, examining a donated artwork, a watercolor painting of the courthouse where I spent most of my working day. She was surrounded by her usual group of fellow junior associates, ambitious young lawyers all competing for the same promotions and trying to impress the same senior partners. I could see her face change from surprise to something that looked almost like panic as she realized I was actually here. She'd invited me, but clearly hadn't expected me to accept. Her colleagues were already asking questions about the casually dressed older man, who seemed to know some of the most important people in the room. I watched as she whispered something to her closest work friend, Sarah Chen, Judge Chen's daughter as it happened, and saw Sarah's eyes widen slightly. "Rebecca," I said, approaching their group with a warm smile, "thank you for inviting me. This is quite an impressive event." Her response was stiff, almost formal. "Oh, hi. I wasn't sure you'd actually come." She turned to her colleagues with a forced smile. "Everyone, this is my older brother. He has a small legal practice across town." The way she said small legal practice made it sound like I ran a roadside tax preparation service. I noticed Judge Chen watching this interaction from her table, her expression unreadable. Senior partner Morrison was also within earshot. Her conversation momentarily paused as she glanced in our direction. What Rebecca didn't realize was that she was about to set into motion a series of events that would change not just her evening but potentially her entire career trajectory. All because she couldn't resist the opportunity to show her colleagues that even though I might know some important people, I was still just her older brother who'd never quite lived up to his potential. At least that's what she thought. The awkwardness of Rebecca's introduction hung in the air like expensive perfume gone stale. Her colleague Sarah Chen, a sharp young attorney with her mother's keen eyes, extended her hand politely. "It's nice to meet you. What kind of law do you practice?" Before I could answer, Rebecca jumped in with a laugh that sounded forced even to my ears. "Oh, he does mostly small stuff. Veterans cases, family disputes, that sort of thing. Nothing too exciting." Her tone carried the subtle condescension she'd perfected over the years, the same one she'd used when telling people I was still finding myself after my military service. I noticed Judge Chen's daughter stiffened slightly at her mother's name, and I caught the brief exchange of glances between Sarah and another associate, Marcus Webb. They clearly knew something Rebecca didn't, but I simply smiled and nodded. "I try to help people who need it most." "How noble," Rebecca said, and there was no mistaking the sarcasm now, "though I suppose someone has to handle the cases that don't pay well." Her colleagues shifted uncomfortably, but she was just getting started. Word of the family drama was spreading through the young associates like wildfire. Rebecca seemed to feed off the attention, her confidence growing as more of her peers gathered around. Senior associates David Kim and Lisa Rodriguez joined the circle, drinks in hand, sensing entertainment. "You know," Rebecca continued, her voice carrying further than necessary, "I've been trying to convince him to maybe apply to some of the bigger firms. I mean, after a certain age, you really should be thinking about your retirement planning." She gestured around the elegant room. "This is what success in law looks like. The partnerships, the prestige, the real cases that matter." I watched as Judge Chen excused herself from her table and began walking in our direction, her expression unreadable. Senior partner Morrison was also moving closer, though she appeared to be examining the silent auction items near us. The circle of young attorneys grew larger, drawn by the spectacle of Rebecca publicly dissecting her older brother's career choices. "I mean, don't get me wrong," Rebecca said, warming to her theme. "Helping veterans is nice and all, but let's be realistic about the financial prospects. Some of us have student loans to pay off and actual careers to build." Marcus Webb looked increasingly uncomfortable. As a former military man himself, he seemed to recognize something in my bearing that Rebecca was missing entirely. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "maybe we should—" "Oh, don't worry about his feelings," Rebecca interrupted. "He's used to it. He's always been the dreamer in the family while I've been the practical one." I stood quietly through her performance, my hands clasped behind my back in a stance that was part military bearing, part courtroom composure. Years of dealing with hostile witnesses and cross-examinations had taught me the value of patience. Sometimes the best strategy was to let people reveal their true character without interference. "Rebecca," I said gently, "perhaps we should—" She said, turning to her audience with theatrical exasperation. He's always trying to change the subject when we talk about real success. I think it makes him uncomfortable to see what he could have achieved if he'd made different choices. Sarah Chen was now staring at her phone, her face pale. I caught a glimpse of the screen. She was clearly looking up something urgent. Judge Chen had stopped pretending to examine the artwork and was openly watching our exchange. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Senior partner Morrison had set down her champagne glass and was moving deliberately in our direction. The room was shifting around us in ways Rebecca didn't notice. Conversations were pausing, heads were turning, and several of the most senior people in attendance were converging on our location. Emboldened by what she perceived as my passivity, Rebecca decided to go for broke. "You know what the funny thing is?" she announced to the growing crowd. "He actually thinks his little practice is important, like genuinely believes he's making a difference with his pro bono cases and his veteran clients." The laugh that followed was cruel and cutting. "I keep telling him he should get serious about his career, maybe apply to be a public defender or something. At least that would be steady government work." Lisa Rodriguez winced visibly. As someone who'd spent time in the public defender's office, she understood exactly how dismissive Rebecca was being about essential legal services. The other associates were looking increasingly uncomfortable, but Rebecca was too caught up in her performance to note. "I mean, let's be honest," she continued, gesturing at my casual attire. "Does this look like someone who's achieved anything significant in the legal profession? He's 45 years old and still dressing like he's going to a barbecue." That's when I saw senior partner Morrison finally reach the edge of our circle. Her face was a mask of professional composure, but her eyes were sharp with interest. Judge Chen was only steps behind her, and I could see other judges and senior attorneys throughout the room, beginning to pay attention to our little drama. "Rebecca," Sarah Chen's voice cut through her cousin's monologue like a knife. She was holding her phone, her face now completely white. "You need to stop talking, right now." But Rebecca was beyond listening. The attention, the alcohol, and years of suppressed sibling rivalry had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. "Oh, come on, Sarah. You don't have to protect his feelings. We're all lawyers here. We know what real success looks like." She gestured grandly around the room. "This is real success, partnership track positions at firms like Morrison Associates, not some tiny office handling cases that nobody else wants." Judge Chen had now reached the outer edge of our circle, her expression grave. Senior partner Morrison was standing directly behind Rebecca, who remained oblivious to the growing audience of increasingly senior legal professionals. "I keep telling him," Rebecca continued, her voice carrying across the now quiet section of the room, "that if he really wanted to make something of himself, he should have stayed in the military. At least then he'd have a decent pension. Instead, he's playing lawyer in some strip mall office, pretending that what he does matters in the real world." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the jazz music seemed to fade into the background, as every conversation in our vicinity stopped. Rebecca finally seemed to notice that something had changed, her smile faltering, as she looked around at the sea of suddenly serious faces surrounding us. That's when senior partner Morrison stepped forward, and I knew the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. "Margaret," Rebecca's voice suddenly brightened as she spotted her firm's senior partner approaching. Here was her chance to really shine, to show the most important person at Morrison Associates exactly where she stood in comparison to her underachieving older brother. "Morrison, I'd like you to meet my brother," Rebecca said with theatrical enthusiasm. "I was just telling everyone about his quaint little legal practice." The word quaint dripped with condescension. "Maybe you could give him some advice about how to build a real career in law." I watched Margaret Morrison's face carefully. We'd known each other for 15 years, ever since she was a junior partner and I was establishing my practice. Her expression was a masterpiece of professional control, but I could see the storm brewing behind her eyes. "Actually," Rebecca continued, apparently mistaking Morrison's silence for interest, "I think it would be hilarious if you offered him an interview. Can you imagine my charity case brother trying to explain why someone like Morrison Associates should hire someone who's spent his career in strip mall offices?" The cruelty in her voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't just sibling rivalry or professional jealousy. This was deliberate humiliation designed to elevate herself at my expense. She was using me as a stepping stone to impress her boss, publicly degrading her own family member to score career points. Judge Chen had now positioned herself directly beside Margaret Morrison, her judicial robes replaced by an elegant evening gown, but her authority unmistakable to anyone who knew the legal community. "Rebecca," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years on the bench, "you might want to reconsider your approach here." But Rebecca was past the point of listening to warning. She was riding high on what she perceived as her moment of triumphs, surrounded by colleagues and superiors finally showing everyone exactly where she stood in relation to her mediocre older brother. "Oh, Judge Chen, you're too kind," Rebecca said dismissively. "But honestly, someone needs to tell him the truth. He's been deluding himself for years about the importance of his work." She turned back to the crowd, which had now grown to include most of the junior and senior associates at the firm, several city officials and half a dozen judges. "I mean, look at him," she continued, gesturing at my casual attire. "Does this look like someone who belongs in a room with actual successful attorneys? He probably thinks representing people who can't afford real lawyers makes him some kind of hero." Margaret Morrison stepped closer, her voice low but clear. "Rebecca, I strongly suggest you stop talking, right now." But Rebecca had crossed into territory where pride and alcohol and years of suppressed resentment had formed a toxic combination that made retreat impossible. "You know what?" Rebecca announced, her voice rising with drunken confidence. "I'm glad he's here tonight. Everyone should see this. This is what happens when you don't have real ambition, when you settle for mediocrity, and convince yourself it's no." She turned to face me directly, her eyes bright with malicious glee. "You want to know what I really think, big brother? I think you're a failure. I think you wasted your potential, wasted your education, and now you're just a small-town lawyer pretending to matter. And frankly, I'm embarrassed to be related to you." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah Chen had actually stepped backward, her hand over her mouth. Marcus Webb was shaking his head slowly, his expression one of profound disbelief. Even the servers had stopped circulating, sensing the dramatic tension that was about to explode. "I mean, seriously," Rebecca continued, apparently mistaking the horrified silence for rapt attention. "When people ask me about my family, I tell them my brother never really found his calling. Because what else can you say about someone whose biggest achievement is a tiny legal practice that probably doesn't even turn a profit?" That's when Margaret Morrison's professional composure finally cracked. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of someone who'd built one of the most successful law firms in the state, but also a note of barely controlled fury that made several people in the crowd take an involuntary step backward. "Rebecca," she said, her words precise and cutting, "you have just made the single worst career mistake I have ever witnessed in 30 years of practicing law." The room went absolutely silent. Even the background music seemed to stop as every person in the vicinity turned to watch what was clearly about to become a legendary moment in legal community gossip. Judge Chen moved to stand beside me, her presence a clear signal of support and respect that couldn't be misinterpreted by anyone with eyes. City Attorney Rodriguez appeared at my other side, his expression grim. One by one, the most powerful people in the room began to position themselves in a way that made their allegiances unmistakably clear. Rebecca looked around at the shifting dynamics, her smile finally beginning to fade, as some primitive survival instinct started sending warning signals through her alcohol-fogged brain. What do you mean?" she stammered. Margaret Morrison's voice, when she answered, carried to every corner of the now silent room. "What I mean, Rebecca, is that you have just spent the last 20 minutes publicly humiliating and insulting the person who, in addition to being one of the most respected attorneys in this city, also happens to..." She paused, letting the tension build as Rebecca's face began to drain of color. "Judge David Thompson, Circuit Court Judge David Thompson, who has presided over more major cases in this jurisdiction than any sitting judge. Judge Thompson, who completed 2 combat tours as a Marine officer before earning his law degree with highest honors. Judge Thompson, who built his practice into one of the most respected firms in the state before accepting his appointment to the bench." The words hit Rebecca like physical blows. I watched as understanding dawned in her eyes, followed immediately by the kind of pure, undiluted horror that comes with the realization that you've just destroyed your own life in public. And most relevantly to your career, Rebecca, Margaret Morrison continued, her voice now carrying a note of grim satisfaction. Judge Thompson is the primary investor and silent partner who owns 49% of Morrison Associates. He's not just my business partner, he's my boss. The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the city traffic 20 floors below. Rebecca's face went through a spectrum of colors that would have been fascinating to observe under different circumstances. First, the flush of alcohol-induced confidence drained away, leaving pale confusion. Then came the sickly green of dawning comprehension, followed by the ashen gray of complete horror, as the full implications hit her. "Judge Thompson?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the faces of her colleagues, some shocked, some embarrassed, most looking anywhere but at her. The same people who'd been enjoying her performance moments ago were now treating her like she had a contagious disease. Margaret Morrison stepped closer, her professional demeanor firmly back in place, but her words carried the weight of finality. "Judge Thompson has been my business partner for 8 years, Rebecca. He provided the capital that allowed us to expand into our current offices. His investment made possible most of the high-profile cases that built this firm's reputation. The pro bono work he insisted we incorporate into our practice has earned us more respect in the legal community than any advertising could buy." I watched my sister process this information, seeing her mental calculations crumbling in real time. Every dismissive comment about my small practice, every joke about my strip mall office, every condescending remark about my career choices was now revealed to be an attack on someone who could destroy her professional future with a single phone call. The room was waiting for my response. 100 legal professionals held their breath, wondering how a sitting judge would handle being publicly humiliated by a junior associate. The old me, the Marine who'd faced down enemy fire, might have responded with fury. But years on the bench had taught me that true power lies not in retaliation, but in measured justice. "Rebecca," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence, "you're my sister, and despite everything that's happened tonight, that hasn't changed." I could see the flicker of hope in her eyes, the desperate grasping at the possibility that family loyalty might save her from the consequences of her actions. However, I continued, and that hope died instantly. "What you've displayed tonight isn't just disrespect toward me personally. You've shown fundamental character flaws that raise serious questions about your fitness to practice law. You've publicly mocked the clients I serve, veterans who've sacrificed for this country, families struggling through their worst moments, people who trust the legal system to treat them with dignity." Judge Chen nodded approvingly from beside me. Several other judges in attendance murmured agreement. This wasn't about personal offense anymore. This was about professional standards and the integrity of the legal profession. "You've also," I added, looking directly at Margaret Morrison, "shown remarkable poor judgment by attempting to use family relationships to advance your career through the public humiliation of others. That kind of behavior reflects poorly not just on you, but on any organization that employs you." Margaret Morrison's response was swift and decisive. "Rebecca, you're suspended pending a full review by the partners. Please collect your personal items and surrender your access credentials to building security before you leave tonight." The words hit Rebecca like physical blows. "Miss Morrison, please, there's nothing to discuss," Morrison cut her off. "Your behavior tonight was witnessed by half the legal community. You've embarrassed yourself, this firm, and shown a stunning lack of professional judgment. Frankly, I'm not sure how we come back from this." Sarah Chen, who'd been standing frozen throughout the entire debacle, finally found her voice. "Rebecca, I tried to warn you. I was looking up Judge Thompson on my phone. I tried to get you to stop." Marcus Webb shook his head in disgust. 3 tours in Afghanistan, graduated summa cum laude from law school, 15 years of distinguished service on the bench, and you called him a failure. In front of everyone. I can't." The other associates were backing away from Rebecca as if her career suicide might be contagious. In the space of 20 minutes she'd gone from rising star to professional pariah, and everyone in the room knew. Word of the incident was already spreading through the legal community like wildfire. I could see people discreetly typing on their phones, sharing the story with colleagues who weren't present. By morning, every law firm in the city would know about the associate who'd publicly humiliated a circuit court judge and business partner. Judge Patricia Chen approached me with a rueful smile. "David, I'm sorry you had to endure that, but I have to say, your restraint was masterful. That could have gone much worse for her." City Attorney Rodriguez clapped me on the shoulder. "Judge, you handled that with more grace than she deserved. The legal community won't forget this, either her behavior or your response to it." Several other attorneys approached throughout the evening, offering apologies for what I'd experienced and praise for my handling of the situation. What had started as a humiliating attack had somehow transformed into a moment that enhanced my reputation while destroying Rebecca. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing alone on the balcony overlooking the city. The noise and drama of the party felt distant now, replaced by a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served without me having to lift a finger. Rebecca had destroyed herself through her own choices, her own words, her own character flaws. Margaret Morrison joined me, 2 glasses of bourbon in her hands. "You know," she said, handing me a drink, "I've been thinking about expanding our Veteran Services division. With your background and connections, you'd be perfect to head that up. Full partnership, of course." I smiled, looking out at the city lights. "Margaret, I appreciate the offer, but I think I'm exactly where I need to be. My practice serves people who need me, and that's worth more than any partnership." She nodded approvingly. "That's exactly why you're the right person for the job. The offer stands whenever you're ready." Inside, the party was continuing, but Rebecca was nowhere to be seen. She'd collected her things and left, her career at Morrison Associates over before it had really begun. Her colleagues were still processing what they'd witnessed, many of them learning valuable lessons about humility, respect, and the dangers of making assumptions about people. As for me, I'd gotten exactly what I came for, a chance to reconnect with the legal community and remind myself why I chose the path I did. Sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones you fight for, but the ones that come from simply being who you are and letting others reveal who they are. The next morning, I returned to my small office, to my veteran clients, to my pro bono cases, and to the work that actually mattered. Rebecca would have to find her own way forward, hopefully having learned that true success isn't about titles or prestige, it's about character, integrity, and the courage to do what's right, even when no one is watching. But that's a lesson she'll have to learn on her own. The next day brought a cascade of consequences that Rebecca couldn't have imagined in her worst nightmares. By 8 a.m., the story had spread through every major law firm in the city. The legal community, like any professional network, thrived on gossip, and the tale of a junior associate publicly humiliating a circuit court judge was too juicy to keep quiet. Rebecca's phone had been buzzing since dawn with calls from reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of the story. Legal blogs were already running headlines like "Associate's Career Ends at Charity Gala," and "When Networking Goes Nuclear." The local bar association's message boards were lighting up with discussions about professional conduct and respect for the judiciary. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my modest office, reviewing case files for a veteran's disability hearing, when Margaret Morrison called. "David, I wanted you to know that we've made the suspension permanent. Rebecca won't be returning to Morrison & Associates." I set down my coffee and leaned back in my chair. "That seems decisive. The partners met this morning," Margaret explained. "What happened last night wasn't just about you, though that would have been enough." She showed a fundamental lack of judgment, professionalism, and basic human decency. Those aren't qualities we can train out of someone, they're character flaws that run too deep. By noon, the story had reached the State Bar Association. Rebecca received a formal notice that her conduct was under review, triggered by multiple complaints from attorneys who'd witnessed the incident. The legal profession takes its reputation seriously, and publicly disrespecting a sitting judge was the kind of behavior that could result in disciplinary action. Sarah Chen called me around lunchtime, her voice heavy with embarrassment. "Judge Thompson, I wanted to apologize for not stopping her sooner. I knew who you were. My mother talks about you all the time. I should have said something before it went so far." "Sarah," I said gently, "you tried to warn her. Sometimes people have to learn consequences the hard way. That's not your responsibility." "She's been calling me all morning," Sarah continued, "asking if I can talk to my mother, if you might reconsider, if there's any way to fix this. I don't think she understands that some mistakes can't be undone." That afternoon, Rebecca showed up at my office unannounced. My secretary, Mrs. Rodriguez, a veteran's widow I'd helped with her husband's benefits case, looked uncertain about whether to let her in. "It's okay, Maria," I told her. "Family is family." Rebecca entered looking like she hadn't slept. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled, her eyes red from crying. She'd clearly been rehearsing her speech. "David, I'm sorry," she began, her voice shaking. "I was drunk. I was showing off. I made a terrible mistake. But surely you can understand." I held up a hand to stop her. "Rebecca, sit down." She perched on the edge of the chair across from my desk like she might need to run at any moment. The confident, dismissive woman from the night before was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the gravity of what she'd done. "Do you know why I chose this practice?" I asked. "Why I turned down offers from big firms, why I work with veterans and families instead of corporate clients." She shook her head, tears starting to form. "Because I learned something in Afghanistan that apparently I never taught you. Real strength isn't about power over others. It's about using whatever power you have to help people who need it. Real success isn't about impressing people at parties. It's about making a difference in actual lives." While Rebecca sat in my office pleading for intervention I couldn't provide, the professional consequences were multiplying. 3 major law firms had already called their contacts at Morrison Associates to ensure Rebecca's name was flagged in their system. Law school career counselors were using her story as a cautionary tale about professional conduct. Judge Patricia Chen had mentioned the incident to several colleagues during their weekly judicial meeting. Not to gossip but to highlight the importance of maintaining dignity and respect in all professional interactions. The story was becoming a teaching moment throughout the legal community. City Attorney Rodriguez had updated his staff about the incident, emphasizing that any similar behavior toward judges or opposing counsel would result in immediate dismissal. Rebecca's actions were serving as a negative example that was actually improving professional standards across the board. Local legal publications were planning feature articles about respect in the legal profession. The State Bar Association was considering new continuing education requirements about professional conduct. Rebecca's 20 minutes of poor judgment were creating positive changes that would benefit the entire legal community. Veterans advocacy groups had somehow heard about a judge being mocked for serving their community, and several had reached out to express support. My small practice was receiving referrals from attorneys who wanted to work with someone who clearly understood the values of service and humility. Margaret Morrison called again that evening. "David, I know you declined my partnership offer, but I want you to know something. What happened last night reminded everyone why integrity matters more than ambition. You've become something of a folk hero in legal circles." As Rebecca prepared to leave my office, she made one last desperate attempt. "David, I know I can't undo what I said, but isn't there some community service, some public apology? I'll do anything." I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw someone who was finally beginning to understand that actions have consequences. "Rebecca, the only person who can fix this is you. Not through connections or favors or apologies, but by becoming the kind of person who would never treat anyone the way you treated me last night." She nodded, tears flowing freely now. "I've lost everything, haven't I?" "You've lost a job," I correct. "Whether you've lost your future depends entirely on what you do next." That evening, I returned home to my modest house in the suburb. My wife, Ellen, had already heard about the incident through her own professional networks. She was a nurse at the VA hospital where many of my clients received care. "So," she said over dinner, "how does it feel to be the talk of the legal community?" I smiled, thinking about Rebecca's destroyed career, the lessons being learned throughout the profession, and the renewed appreciation for integrity and respect that was spreading through my professional world. Honestly, it feels like justice, I said. Not revenge. There's a difference. Ellen raised her wine glass. To justice then, and to reminding people that true success isn't about who you impress, it's about who you help. As we clinked glasses, I realized that sometimes the most important victories come not from fighting back, but from simply being who you are, and letting the truth speak for itself. The legal community has a long memory, and Rebecca's story had become legendary in all the worst ways. She'd moved back in with our parents in Ohio, unable to find work at any respectable law firm. The incident had made national legal news when a prominent legal blog picked up the story, turning it into a case study about professional conduct that was being taught in law schools across the country. I learned about Rebecca's struggles through our mother, who called weekly with updates delivered in the careful tone of someone trying not to take sides in a family conflict. She's working as a paralegal at a small firm in Columbus, Mom reported during one of our conversations. The pay is terrible, but at least it's legal work. What Mom didn't say, but I could hear in her voice, was the question that hung between us. Would I ever forgive Rebecca? Would our family relationship survive what she'd done? The answer was complicated. I'd forgiven her, that was necessary for my own peace of mind. But forgiveness didn't erase consequences, and it didn't automatically restore trust or relationships to their previous state. Meanwhile, my own practice had transformed in ways I never expected. The story of the charity gala had somehow enhanced my reputation throughout the legal community. Attorneys were referring more cases to me, not out of pity, but out of respect for how I'd handled the situation. Margaret Morrison had been persistent about the partnership offer, eventually restructuring it into a consulting arrangement that allowed me to maintain my independent practice while taking on complex cases that required my specific expertise. It was the best of both worlds, access to resources for my clients, while maintaining the autonomy to serve those who needed it most. Judge Patricia Chen had recommended me to the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee, where I now served as an advisor on professional conduct cases. Ironically, I occasionally reviewed cases similar to Rebecca's, attorneys who'd shown poor judgment, disrespected colleagues, or violated professional standards. Each time I thought about my sister and wondered if different guidance earlier in her career might have prevented her downfall. 6 months after the incident, Rebecca did something that surprised everyone. She enrolled in a master's program in social work. Mom called with the news, her voice cautiously optimistic. She says she wants to work with families in crisis, Mom explained. Help people navigate the system when they're at their lowest point, she mentioned. She mentioned your work with veterans, and how it made her realize what really matters. It was the first sign that Rebecca might actually be learning from her mistakes, rather than simply wallowing in them. Social work wouldn't pay well, but it was honest work that helped people, the kind of work she'd once mocked me for pursuing. A year after the charity gala, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was hesitant, subdued, a far cry from the confident woman who'd publicly humiliated me. David? It's Rebecca. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I leaned back in my office chair, looking out at the modest space that had become the center of a thriving practice built on genuine service, rather than prestige. It's okay, Rebecca. How are you? I'm graduating next month, she said, from the social work program. I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about what you said about becoming the kind of person who wouldn't treat someone the way I treated you. There was a long pause before she continued. I work with families now. Veterans' families, most when they're struggling with benefits, dealing with PTSD, trying to navigate systems that don't always make sense. And every day I think about how dismissive I was of that work, how cruel I was about the people you serve. I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness, Rebecca continued, her voice stronger now. I'm calling to thank you. That surprised me. Thank me? You could have destroyed me completely that night, she said. You had every right to use your influence to make sure I never worked in law again anywhere. Instead, you let me destroy myself and then left me to figure out how to rebuild. That was exactly what I needed. She paused, and I could hear her taking a shaky breath. I'm not the same person I was that night, David. I understand now that everything I thought was important, the prestige, the money, the status, none of it matters if you don't have character. You tried to teach me that growing up, but I had to learn it the hard way. There's something else, Rebecca said. I've been attending support groups for family members of veterans, learning about the challenges they face, the sacrifices they make. I volunteer at a clinic that helps with legal issues, benefits appeals, housing problems, family law case. The irony wasn't lost on me. My sister, who'd once mocked my work with veterans, was now dedicating her life to serving the same community. The other volunteers don't know about what happened between us, she continued. But they know I have a brother who's a judge, and they speak about you with such respect. They tell stories about cases you've handled, families you've helped, lives you've changed, and I realize that while I was chasing empty success, you were building something real. I'm proud of you, Rebecca, I said, and meant it. What you're doing now, that's the work that matters. I know I can't undo what I did, she said. I know our relationship may never be what it was, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand why you chose the path you did, and I'm trying to follow your example, even if I'm starting 20 years too late. We talked for another hour, catching up on family news and her work with veterans' families. It wasn't the relationship we'd had before, too much had happened for them, but it was something new, built on mutual respect rather than sibling rivalry and genuine understanding rather than surface pleasantries. After hanging up, I sat in my office, thinking about the journey that had brought us both to this point. Rebecca's public humiliation had been devastating for her, but it had also been transformational. She'd lost a prestigious job, but found meaningful work. She'd sacrificed her ego but gained character. The legal community still remembered the incident, but now it was told as a story of redemption as much as consequences. Rebecca had become proof that people could change, that rock bottom could be a foundation for rebuilding rather than an endpoint. As for me, the incident had clarified my own values and strengthened my resolve to continue the work I'd always believed in. The practice continued to grow, not through aggressive marketing or high-profile cases, but through word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied clients, and the respect of colleagues, who understood what real success looked like. That evening, I called our mother to share the news of Rebecca's call. Mom cried, tears of relief and joy that her children had found their way back to each other, if not to where they'd started, then to somewhere better. Sometimes the best stories aren't about heroes and villains, but about people who make mistakes, face consequences, and find the courage to become better versions of themselves. The annual charity fundraiser at Morrison Associates had become something of a legend in legal circles, though not for the reasons Margaret Morrison had originally intended. What was supposed to be a routine networking event had become the source of the most famous professional conduct story in the state's legal history. This year, as I walked through the same elegant venue where my sister had destroyed her career, I reflected on how much had changed for everyone involved. Margaret Morrison approached me with her usual warm smile, but there was something different in her demeanor, a deeper respect that had developed over our years of working together. David, I'm glad you decided to come tonight. There's someone I'd like you to meet. She gestured toward a young woman in a conservative navy suit, who was speaking earnestly with a group of junior associates. Jessica Martinez, first-year associate. She's been asking about you specifically. As we approached, I overheard the young woman's conversation. And that's why professional conduct isn't just about following rules. It's about understanding that every interaction reflects on your character and the profession as a whole. Judge Thompson's restraint in that situation has become a masterclass in dignity under pressure. Jessica turned as we approached, her eyes widening slightly with recognition. Judge Thompson, I was just telling my colleagues about the case study we analyzed in our professional responsibility class. Your handling of the 2019 incident has become required reading at most law schools. I smiled, still somewhat uncomfortable with the fame that had emerged from that difficult evening. I hope the lesson isn't about family dynamics, I said with gentle humor. Actually, it's about multiple things, Jessica replied earnestly. Restraint under provocation, the importance of letting actions speak louder than words, and how true professional success is measured by character rather than position. But mostly it's about how one person's poor judgment can become a learning opportunity for thousands of future lawyers. Margaret Morrison nodded approvingly. Jessica wrote her law review article on professional conduct standards, using your situation as a primary example. It's been cited in several state bar publications. What I learned that evening surprised me. The story of Rebecca's public meltdown and my response had taken on a life of its own in legal education. Professor Williams, from the State University's law school, had been using it as a teaching tool for 5 years running. The incident had been incorporated into ethics training programs across multiple states. Videos of similar situations, attorneys showing poor judgment in public settings, were now labeled as Rebecca moments in professional development seminar. But perhaps more importantly, the story had sparked genuine changes in how law firms approached professional development. Morrison Associates had implemented mandatory quarterly sessions on workplace conduct and professional respect. Other firms had followed suit, creating environments where young attorneys were better prepared to handle the pressures and temptations that had led to Rebecca's downfall. Judge Patricia Chen, now approaching retirement, had made the story a cornerstone of her speeches to new bar admittees. "Character is not what you do when everyone is watching," she would tell them. "Character is what you do when you think no one important is watching, because someone always is, and everyone is important." Speaking of Rebecca, she had completed her master's degree and was now running a non-profit organization that provided legal and social services to veterans' families. The irony of her career path never ceased to amaze me. The woman who had once mocked my work with veterans now spent her days advocating for the same community she'd dismissed. Our mother had called the previous week with an update that filled me with quiet pride. "She's been nominated for a state social work award," Mom reported, for her advocacy work with military families. The nomination letter mentioned her innovative approaches to helping veterans navigate complex legal and social service systems. Rebecca and I spoke regularly now, our relationship rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect and shared commitment to service. She often called for advice on legal issues her clients faced, and I referred cases to her organization when families needed social services support. Our professional collaboration had grown into something neither of us could have imagined during those dark days after the charity gala. As the evening progressed, Margaret Morrison took the microphone for the annual awards presentation. "Tonight we have a special recognition," she announced. 5 years ago, this event became the setting for what turned into one of the most important lessons our legal community has ever learned about character, dignity, and professional conduct. My stomach clenched as I realized where this was heading. Judge David Thompson exemplified the highest standards of our profession during a difficult personal situation, and his response has educated thousands of legal professionals about the importance of integrity under pressure. Tonight, we're presenting him with the Morrison Associates Award for Professional Excellence. The applause was thunderous, but what moved me most was seeing the faces in the crowd. Young attorneys who looked at me with genuine respect, senior partners who nodded approvingly, and judges who understood the weight of the moment. This wasn't about the incident itself anymore. It was about the ongoing impact of choosing dignity over retaliation. As I accepted the award, I looked out at an audience that included many of the same people who had witnessed Rebecca's meltdown 5 years earlier. But I also saw new faces, young attorneys just starting their careers, law students interning for the summer, paralegals and support staff who kept the legal system functioning. 5 years ago, I learned something important in this very room. I learned that our response to adversity defines us more than the adversity itself. I learned that true strength lies not in our ability to retaliate, but in our commitment to our principles even when we're tested. I paused, thinking about Rebecca's journey from that night to her current work serving veterans' families. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that people can change, that mistakes, even public ones, can become catalysts for growth if we have the courage to face them honestly and the determination to become better. The speech wasn't long, but it was heartfelt. I spoke about the importance of treating every person with dignity regardless of their position or our relationship to them. I talked about the responsibility that comes with professional privilege and the obligation to use our skills and knowledge in service of justice, rather than personal advancement. As the evening wound down, I found myself in the same spot where Rebecca had stood 5 years earlier, but now surrounded by colleagues who sought my counsel rather than my humiliation. Young attorneys asked for career advice, judges discussed complex cases, law students inquired about judicial clerkships, but the moment that mattered most came as I was leaving. Jessica Martinez, the first-year associate, approached me one final time. "Judge Thompson," she said, I wanted you to know that your story changed my approach to law school. Instead of focusing just on grades and prestigious internships, I started volunteering at a veterans clinic. I learned more about being a lawyer in those 3 hours a week than I did in some of my regular class. That was the real victory, not the award, not the recognition, but the knowledge that one difficult evening had rippled outward to inspire a new generation of attorneys to choose service over self-interest, character over ambition. As I drove home that night, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. Rebecca's public attack had been devastating in the moment, but it had ultimately strengthened both of us and educated countless others. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the foundation for the best chapters that follow. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in early spring, 10 years to the day after the charity gala that had changed everything. I was reviewing case files in my chambers when my clerk knocked on the door with an unusual expression. "Judge Thompson, you have a call from Rebecca," she said. "She says it's important family news." I picked up the phone expecting updates about our aging parents or perhaps news about her organization. Instead, I heard something in Rebecca's voice I hadn't heard in years, excitement mixed with nervousness. "David, I have something to tell you and I wanted you to hear it from me first," she began. "I've been selected as the new Director of Veterans Affairs for the state. The appointment was announced this morning." I set down my pen, genuinely surprised. The State Director of Veterans Affairs was a significant position, overseeing services for nearly 400,000 veterans across multiple counties. It was the kind of appointment that typically went to former military officers or career bureaucrats, not social workers with complicated professional histories. "Rebecca, that's incredible," I said. "How did this?" What Rebecca told me next was a story I could never have imagined 10 years earlier. After completing her master's degree, she had started small, working with individual families, helping them navigate bureaucratic mazes, advocating for benefits that had been wrongfully denied. Her work had come to the attention of state legislators who were frustrated with the existing Veterans Affairs system. "Senator Williams was dealing with a case I helped resolve," Rebecca explained. "A veteran who'd been fighting for disability benefits for 3 years. The family was about to lose their home when I got involved. I managed to get the case expedited and the benefits approved within 6 weeks. The senator had been so impressed that he'd started referring other difficult cases to Rebecca's organization. Word spread through the legislature about this social worker who could cut through red tape and actually get results for veterans. When the previous Director of Veterans Affairs retired under a cloud of scandal and inefficiency, Rebecca's name had come up repeatedly as someone who understood both the system and the people it was supposed to serve. The confirmation hearing was yesterday," she continued. "Senator Martinez, you remember him from the legal community. He stood up and said that sometimes the best person for a job is someone who's learned from their mistakes and dedicated their life to making amends. He said my personal transformation was exactly what the Veterans Affairs Office needed." As I listened to Rebecca describe her new role, I couldn't help but marvel at the complete reversal of our situation. 10 years ago, she had publicly mocked my work with veterans, dismissing it as unimportant and unprofitable. Now she was about to become the state's highest-ranking advocate for the same community she had once ridiculed. But this wasn't cosmic irony. It was earned redemption. Rebecca had spent a decade proving her commitment wasn't just rhetoric or career calculation. She had worked in underfunded nonprofits, taken pay cuts to serve those who needed help most, and built a reputation based on results rather than connection. "There's something else," Rebecca said, her voice becoming more serious. "Part of my new role involves working closely with the judicial system on veterans courts and legal advocacy programs. I'm going to need to build relationships with judges who handle veterans' cases." She paused and I could hear her taking a deep breath. I was wondering if you might be willing to serve on the advisory committee for the new Veterans Court initiative. Your experience with both military service and the legal system would be invaluable." 6 months later, I found myself sitting across from Rebecca in a conference room at the state capitol, surrounded by legislators, veterans advocates, and fellow judges. We were developing a comprehensive plan for specialized courts that would address the unique legal challenges faced by veterans. From PTSD-related offenses to benefit disputes to family law issues complicated by military service, the dynamic between us was remarkable to observe. Rebecca, now confident in her expertise and passionate about her mission, presented data and case studies with the same intensity she had once brought to corporate law, but this time, her ambition was directed toward helping others rather than advancing herself. Judge Thompson brings a unique perspective to this initiative, she told the committee, looking directly at me with genuine respect. His military background, combined with his judicial experience and his understanding of the challenges veterans face in the legal system, makes him invaluable to this project. The other committee members nodded approvingly, unaware of the personal history that made this professional collaboration so meaningful. To them, we were simply two experts working together on an important initiative. But I saw the full circle from the night she had dismissed my work as meaningless, to this moment where she was actively seeking my expertise in the same field. As the months passed, our professional partnership deepened into something neither of us had expected. The Veterans Court program we helped design became a model for other states. Rebecca's administrative reforms cut processing times for benefits claims. My judicial rulings in veterans' cases were being cited in legal journals as examples of how the court system could better serve those who had served their country. But the most meaningful measure of our success came in the individual stories: veterans who received the help they needed, families who kept their homes, young service members who got second chances instead of criminal records. Each case we handled successfully felt like a small act of redemption for the pain we had caused each other and ourselves 10 years earlier. On the anniversary of the charity gala incident, Rebecca and I had dinner together for the first time in over a decade. Not a family obligation or professional meeting, but a genuine attempt to reconnect as siblings who had both been transformed by their shared experience. "You know," she said over coffee, "I used to think that night was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Losing my job, my reputation, my entire career plan, it felt like the end of the world." She looked out the restaurant window at the city lights, much like the view from the charity gala where everything had changed. "But if it hadn't happened, I would never have found this work. I would never have learned what it means to truly serve others. I would probably still be chasing empty prestige instead of meaningful impact." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. That night taught me something too. It reminded me why I chose the path I did, and it showed me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply be who we are and let others learn from the contrary. Today, Rebecca and I continue to work together on veterans issues, our professional collaboration built on mutual respect and shared commitment to service. The charity gala incident is still mentioned in legal ethics courses, but now, it's often paired with the story of what came after, how two people transformed a moment of personal and professional disaster into a lifetime of meaningful work. Young attorneys still approach me at professional events to discuss the lessons from that night, but increasingly they also ask about the follow-up story: how Rebecca rebuilt her career through service, how our family relationship was restored through forgiveness and growth, and how a single moment of poor judgment became the catalyst for positive change that continues to ripple outward. The real victory wasn't what happened that night at the charity gala. The real victory was what we both chose to do with the aftermath, how we turned pain into purpose, humiliation into humility, and a broken relationship into a partnership that serves those who need it most. The invitation arrived on elegant cream paper, embossed with the Morrison Associates logo that had become synonymous with the most famous professional conduct story in legal history. "You are cordially invited to attend the 15th annual David Thompson Professional Excellence Dinner," it read. I stared at the invitation with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. They had named their premier professional development event after me. Margaret Morrison, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, had called personally to ensure I would attend. "David, this isn't just a dinner," she explained. "We've been tracking the impact of your story for 15 years now. The data is remarkable, and we want to share it with the legal community." What she didn't tell me, what I would discover that evening, was that Rebecca would be the keynote speaker. The ballroom at Morrison Associates was packed with over 500 legal professionals, from first-year law students to federal judges. Jennifer Williams, a professor of legal ethics at the State University, took the podium first to present findings from a longitudinal study that had been tracking the incident's impact since. Williams began, What you're about to hear represents the most comprehensive analysis ever conducted on how a single moment of professional conduct can reshape an entire profession. The statistics were staggering. Law schools that incorporated our story into their ethics curriculum showed a 47% reduction in reported professional conduct violations among their graduates. Firms that used the incident as a training tool experienced significantly lower turnover among junior associates and higher client satisfaction scores. The story had been translated into 12 languages and was being taught in legal programs across 4 continents. But perhaps most remarkably, Dr. Williams continued, we've identified what we call the Thompson effect, a measurable increase in pro bono work and public service among attorneys who have studied this case. Young lawyers exposed to this story are 73% more likely to pursue careers in public interest law or veterans advocacy. When Rebecca walked to the podium, the audience fell silent. Many knew her story, but few had heard her speak publicly about the transformation that had followed her public humiliation. She had aged gracefully over the 15 years, her hair now streaked with silver, her bearing confident but humble, the demeanor of someone who had learned hard lessons and emerged stronger. 15 years ago in this very room I destroyed my career in 20 minutes, she began, her voice steady and clear. I was arrogant, cruel, and completely wrong about what mattered in the legal profession. I mocked my brother's work with veterans, dismissed the importance of service over profit, and demonstrated everything that's wrong with our profession's worst tendencies. The audience was riveted. This wasn't the typical sanitized professional development presentation. This was raw, honest, and deeply personal. But what happened next changed not just my life, but the lives of thousands of people I've been privileged to serve, Rebecca continued. My brother could have destroyed me completely that night. Instead, he chose dignity over revenge, character over retaliation. He let me face the consequences of my choices, while leaving the door open for redemption. Rebecca then shared statistics from her 15 years in veterans advocacy. Under her leadership, the State Veterans Affairs Office had helped secure over $2.3 billion in benefits for veterans and their families. They had reduced homelessness among veterans by 68%. Every single one of those numbers represents a person, she said, her voice growing emotional. A veteran who got the health care they needed, a family that kept their home, a young service member who got a second chance. And none of it would have happened if my brother hadn't shown me what true character looks like. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. The legal profession talks a lot about justice, Rebecca continued, but that night, I learned the difference between justice and revenge. Justice holds people accountable while leaving room for growth. Revenge simply destroys. My brother chose justice, and that choice didn't just save my life. It saved thousands of others. As Rebecca concluded her speech, she introduced a surprise guest, Jessica Martinez, the young attorney who had approached me 5 years earlier at the anniversary dinner. Now a successful public interest lawyer, Jessica had founded a nonprofit organization that provided legal services to underserved communities. Judge Thompson's story changed my entire approach to law, Jessica told the audience. Instead of chasing prestigious positions at big firms, I chose to serve people who needed help most. In the past 10 years, our organization has handled over 15,000 cases for families who couldn't afford traditional legal representation. But Jessica wasn't alone. The evening featured testimonials from dozens of attorneys whose careers had been influenced by the charity gala incident, public defenders who had been inspired to take difficult cases, corporate lawyers who had increased their pro bono commitments, judges who had implemented veterans courts in their jurisdiction. As the formal program concluded, Rebecca and I found ourselves alone on the same balcony where I had stood 15 years earlier, processing the aftermath of her public attack. The city lights twinkled below us, unchanged despite all the transformation that had occurred. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly, "Not fighting back that night, not using your power to end my career permanently?" I considered her question seriously. "Never," I said. "What you did that night was wrong, but it revealed something important about both of us. It showed me that my values were worth defending, even when I was under attack, and it gave you the opportunity to become the person you were meant to be." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. I've spent 15 years trying to make amends for 20 minutes of cruelty. Some days I wonder if it's enough. Rebecca, I said, putting my hand on her shoulder. You've helped secure benefits for 400,000 veterans. You've kept thousands of families in their homes. You've created programs that will serve people for generations. If that's not enough, then nothing ever could be. As we prepared to leave that evening, Margaret Morrison approached us with a final announcement. David, Rebecca, I wanted you both to know that Morrison Associates has established an endowment at the state law school. The Rebecca Thompson Redemption Scholarship will provide full funding for students who want to pursue careers in public interest law and veterans advocacy. Rebecca's face went pale. You want to name a scholarship after me, after what I did? Margaret smiled warmly. We want to name it after what you became. The scholarship isn't about your worst moment. It's about your best 15 years. As we walked to our cars that night, I reflected on the incredible journey that had brought us to this point. A moment of public humiliation had become a catalyst for institutional change, personal transformation, and widespread inspiration. The story that began with cruelty and professional destruction had evolved into one of the most powerful examples of redemption and character in the legal profession's history. The invitation to the dinner had promised to reveal the final lesson from our story. As I drove home that night, I realized what that lesson was. True character isn't revealed by how we act when everything is going well. It's revealed by how we respond when we're at our worst and what we choose to do with the after. Rebecca had shown that people can fundamentally change when they're willing to face their failures honestly and dedicate themselves to making amends. I had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose grace over retaliation and trust that justice will ultimately prevail. Together, we had proven that even the most painful moments can become the foundation for something beautiful, meaningful, and lasting. The story that began with a sister's cruel mockery had become a testament to the transformative power of character, forgiveness, and the choice to serve something greater than ourselves. The call came at 6:30 a.m. on a cold November morning, 20 years after the charity gala that had changed everything. I was preparing for another day in chambers when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was shaky, desperate. A tone I hadn't heard from Rebecca in 2 decades. "David, I need your help," she said without preamble. "Something's happened. Something that could destroy everything we've built." My stomach dropped. Over the past 20 years, Rebecca had become one of the most respected voices in veterans advocacy, not just in our state, but nationally. Her organization had expanded to serve veterans in 12 states. She'd testified before Congress, advised 3 different presidential administrations, and received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her service to military families. "What's wrong?" I asked, already reaching for my coat. "There's been an investigation," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The state auditor's office found irregularities in our funding. They're saying we misappropriated federal grants, that we used money designated for veteran services for administrative expenses." "David, they're talking about criminal charges." By the time I reached Rebecca's office, news vans were already lining the street. The story was breaking on every major network. Veterans advocate under investigation for fraud. Social media was exploding with reactions ranging from disbelief to calls for immediate prosecution. The irony was devastating. The woman who had spent 20 years making amends for a moment of professional misconduct was now facing accusations of financial impropriety. Rebecca's assistant, Maria Santos, met me at the back entrance. "Judge Thompson, thank God you're here," she said, her eyes red from crying. "The phones haven't stopped ringing. Reporters are demanding statements. The board of directors is in emergency session." Inside, I found Rebecca in her office, surrounded by boxes of financial records and legal documents. She looked older than her 57 years, the weight of the allegations clearly crushing. This was the same woman who had confidently addressed 500 legal professionals just 5 years earlier, now reduced to someone who looked like she was drowning. "Tell me everything," I said, closing the door behind me. What Rebecca told me was every nonprofit director's nightmare. The investigation had revealed a complex web of financial transactions that, while technically legal, appeared to violate the spirit of federal grant requirements. Money designated for direct veteran services had been used to fund the organization's expansion into new state. Administrative costs had exceeded federal guidelines. Most damaging of all, Rebecca had approved salary increases for key staff, including herself, during the same period when they were supposed to be reducing operational expenses. It wasn't fraud, Rebecca insisted, her voice breaking. Every decision was reviewed by our board, approved by our accountants. We were trying to grow the organization to serve more veterans, but the way the transactions are being presented, it looks terrible. I reviewed the documents throughout the morning, my legal training, automatically analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of the case. The truth was complicated. Rebecca's organization had indeed helped more veterans than any other advocacy group in the region. They had secured billions in benefits, housed thousands of homeless veterans, and created programs that were being replicated nationwide, but they had also played fast and loose with federal grant requirements. Justifying questionable expenses is necessary for their mission. "David, you have to understand," Rebecca said during a break in our document review. "If this goes to trial, it won't just destroy me. It will undermine every program we've created, every veteran we've helped. The organization will collapse. 20 years of work gone." But there was something else in her voice, something I recognized from that night 20 years ago. Fear, not just of professional consequences, but of personal humiliation, of being exposed once again as someone who had failed to live up to the standards she claimed to represent. "Are you guilty?" I asked directly. She was quiet for a long moment. "I'm guilty of believing that the ends justified the means," she finally said. "I'm guilty of thinking that because we were helping people, the rules didn't apply to us the same way. I'm guilty of the same arrogance that destroyed my legal career 20 years ago, just in a different form." As the day progressed, it became clear that Rebecca faced an impossible choice. She could fight the charges, hire expensive lawyers, and drag the case through the courts for years while her organization's reputation was destroyed in the media. Or she could accept responsibility, resign from the organization she'd built, and hope that would be enough to save the programs that served hundreds of thousands of veterans. "What would you do?" she asked me as we sat in her office that evening, the news vans still camped outside. I thought about the question carefully. 20 years earlier, I had chosen restraint over retaliation, character over revenge. The situation was different now, but the fundamental choice was the same. Would Rebecca choose personal preservation or something larger than herself? "What I would do doesn't matter," I said. "The question is, what does the person you've become over the past 20 years do? What would the Rebecca who received the Presidential Medal of Freedom advise someone in this situation?" She nodded slowly, understanding the parallel I was drawing. 20 years ago, you let me face the consequences of my choices instead of trying to protect me from them. You trusted that the truth would ultimately matter more than the immediate pain. And what happened?" I asked. "I became a better person. I found my real purpose. I learned the difference between success and significance." She paused, looking out at the protesters and supporters who had gathered outside her building. "But David, this is different. 20 years ago, I was young and had time to rebuild. Now I'm almost 60. This could be the end of everything. Or," I said gently, "it could be the beginning of something else, something you can't see yet." As we prepared to leave that evening, Rebecca pulled out a framed photo from her desk drawer. It was from the Presidential Medal of Freedom ceremony, showing her shaking hands with the president, while I stood proudly in the background. But behind it was another photo, older, more creased. It was from our childhood, showing two kids building a sandcastle together on a family vacation. "You know what I realized today?" she said, holding both photos. "That night, 20 years ago, I thought my life was over when I lost my job at Morrison Associates. But it was actually the beginning of the most meaningful chapter of my life. Maybe this is the same thing." I looked at my sister, this woman who had spent 2 decades transforming herself from someone I barely recognized into someone I deeply respected, and saw the same courage that had carried her through the aftermath of her public humiliation. "Whatever you decide," I told her, "I'll support you. Not as a judge or a lawyer, but as your brother. The way you supported me through this journey, even when you were struggling with your own transformation." The next morning would bring another media storm, more allegations and pressure from all sides to either fight or surrender. But that night, as we sat in her office, surrounded by the evidence of 20 years of service to others, I saw Rebecca make the same choice that had defined both our lives since that charity gala. She chose character over self-preservation. "I know what I have to do," she said quietly. "It's going to hurt, and it's going to be public, and it might destroy everything I've built, but it's the right thing to do." As I drove home that night, I realized that our story wasn't over. 20 years earlier, we had learned that our worst moments could become our strongest foundation. Now we were about to discover whether that lesson could sustain us through a new kind of crisis, one that threatened not just reputation but the very legacy we had spent 2 decades building together. The next morning, Rebecca called another press conference. This time, however, it wasn't to defend herself or deflect blame. Standing behind the same podium where she had announced countless victories for veterans over the past 2 decades, she looked directly into the cameras and made a choice that would define the final chapter of her career. "Good morning. I'm here today to address the allegations regarding financial irregularities at the Veterans Advocacy Foundation," she began, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "After reviewing all the evidence and consulting with legal counsel, I want to be absolutely clear about several things." The room was packed with reporters, many of whom had covered her rise from a disgraced attorney to a nationally recognized advocate. They sensed this would be a pivotal moment, not just for Rebecca, but for the entire veterans advocacy movement. "First, I accept full responsibility for the financial decisions that have brought us to this point. While every expenditure was approved by our board and reviewed by our accountants, I understand that we failed to meet the strict compliance standards required for federal grant recipients. The buck stops with me." A murmur went through the crowd. This wasn't the typical political non-apology they'd expected. This was a genuine acceptance of responsibility rare in public scandals. "Second, effective immediately, I am resigning as director of the Veterans Advocacy Foundation. The organization has served over 800,000 veterans and their families during my tenure, and that work is too important to be compromised by questions about my leadership." The room erupted with questions, but Rebecca held up her hand for silence. "I want to be clear. This resignation is not an admission of criminal wrongdoing, but it is an acknowledgement that I allowed my passion for our mission to cloud my judgment about compliance requirements. When you believe so deeply in helping people, it's easy to justify bending rules that seem to stand in the way of that mission. That was wrong." I watched from the back of the room, feeling a complex mix of pride and sadness. Rebecca was making the same choice I had watched her make 20 years earlier, choosing integrity over self-preservation, even when it was costly. "This decision comes at great personal cost," Rebecca continued, her voice beginning to crack. "This organization has been my life's work, my way of making amends for past mistakes, my contribution to those who served our country. Leaving it feels like losing a part of myself." She paused, collecting herself before continuing. "But 20 years ago, I learned a valuable lesson about character from my brother, Judge David Thompson. Character isn't about being perfect. It's about taking responsibility when you're not. It's about choosing what's right over what's easy, even when the consequences are severe." The mention of my name sent a ripple through the room. Several reporters turned to look at me, recognizing the connection to the famous charity gala incident that had launched Rebecca's transformation. "Third, I want to assure the veterans and families we serve that this transition will not interrupt critical services. Our board of directors has already approved an interim leadership structure, and we are working with federal oversight agencies to ensure full compliance going forward. Rebecca then introduced Maria Santos, her longtime deputy, who would serve as interim director. Maria had been with the organization for 15 years and was respected throughout the veterans community for her dedication and competence. Maria has my complete confidence and support, Rebecca said. She understands our mission and has the skills to lead this organization forward. The work will continue, and it will continue with the highest standards of both service and compliance. What happened next surprised everyone in the room. Federal Prosecutor James Chen, Judge Patricia Chen's son, stepped forward to make an unexpected announcement. After careful review of all evidence and Thompson's cooperation throughout this investigation, the Department of Justice has decided not to pursue criminal charges, he said. While there were compliance failures, we found no evidence of personal enrichment or intentional fraud. Thompson's resignation and the organization's corrective measures are sufficient resolution of this matter. The relief in the room was palpable, but Rebecca's expression didn't change. She had already made peace with whatever consequences might come. Later that day, Rebecca and I sat in the same coffee shop where we'd had countless conversations over the past 20 years. She looked exhausted but oddly peaceful, like someone who had just set down a heavy burden. "Do you regret it?" I asked. "The way you handled the press conference?" She stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "You know, 20 years ago when I lost my job at Morrison Associates, I thought my life was over, but that moment of public humiliation became the catalyst for the most meaningful work I've ever done. Maybe this is the same thing. What will you do now?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "For the first time in 20 years, I don't have a 5-year plan or a strategic vision, but I've learned that sometimes the best chapters of our lives begin when we think the story is ending." 3 days later, Rebecca received a call that would change everything again. It was from Senator Martinez, now chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. "Rebecca, I've been following the situation with your organization," he said. "I want you to know that everyone in Washington understands what really happened here. You built something extraordinary, and a few compliance issues don't erase 20 years of service." He paused before continuing. "I'm calling because Congress is creating a new position, a special advocate for Veterans Affairs who would work directly with the White House to coordinate services across all federal agencies. It's a presidential appointment, subject to Senate confirmation. We want you to consider it." Rebecca was speechless. After losing everything, she was being offered a position that could potentially help more veterans than she'd ever reached through her nonprofit. "Senator, I appreciate the offer, but given what's just happened—" "Rebecca," he interrupted, "what just happened proved exactly why you're the right person for this job. You took responsibility when things went wrong. You put the mission ahead of your personal interest. You handled a crisis with grace and integrity. Those are exactly the qualities we need in this position," he continued. "Besides, Congress has been watching your work for 20 years. One compliance issue doesn't erase 800,000 veterans helped, 43 state programs created, and billions in benefits secured. We know who you really are." That evening, Rebecca called me with the news about the Senate offer. "David, I need your advice. Part of me thinks I should step away from public service entirely. Maybe teach, or write, or find some quiet way to contribute. But another part of me thinks this could be an opportunity to help even more veterans." I thought about the journey we'd both taken from that terrible night at the charity gala through 20 years of transformation, and now to this new crossroads. "Rebecca, do you remember what you told me at the anniversary dinner 5 years ago? That you'd spent 20 years trying to make amends for 20 minutes of cruelty?" "Yes. Maybe it's time to stop thinking about making amends and start thinking about making a difference. You've proven your character. You've paid whatever debt you owed to the universe. Now the question is, what do you want to do with the rest of your life?" As we ended our conversation that night, I could hear the wheels turning in Rebecca's mind. The scared, desperate woman who had called me a week earlier was being replaced by someone who was beginning to see possibility in the midst of crisis. "You know what the strangest part is?" she said before hanging up. 20 years ago, I thought losing my job was the worst thing that could happen to me. Last week I thought losing this organization was the worst thing that could happen, but maybe neither of those things were endings. Maybe they were just transitions to whatever comes next. The next morning would bring another choice that would shape not just Rebecca's future but the future of veterans advocacy across the entire country. 6 months later, the Senate confirmation hearing for Rebecca's appointment as Special Advocate for Veterans Affairs was unlike anything Washington had seen in years. The gallery was packed with veterans from across the country, many wearing their service medals and holding signs supporting her nomination. But it was also filled with skeptics and critics who questioned whether someone who had just resigned under a cloud of financial irregularities should be trusted with such a significant federal position. I sat in the front row, wearing my judicial robes as a show of support, flanked by Margaret Morrison, now in her 80s but still sharp, and Judge Patricia Chen, recently retired but whose presence carried enormous weight in legal circles. The three of us represented different aspects of Rebecca's journey: the professional consequences of poor judgment, the path to redemption through service, and the importance of character in leadership. Senator Martinez, now the committee chairman, opened the hearing with remarks that immediately set the tone. Today we consider the nomination of Rebecca Thompson to serve as our nation's first Special Advocate for Veterans Affairs. Thompson's qualifications for this position are extraordinary, but so too is the controversy that has surrounded her recent transition from private advocacy to this federal role. The opposition forms. Senator William Harrison, the ranking minority member, wasted no time in launching his attack. Mr. Chairman, while I respect Ms. Thompson's advocacy work, we cannot ignore the fact that she resigned from her organization just 6 months ago due to financial irregularity. How can we trust someone with oversight of billions in federal spending when she failed to properly manage grants at her own organization? Harrison was a former military officer himself, which gave his criticism additional weight. He represented the faction of Congress that believed Rebecca's resignation disqualified her from federal service, regardless of her previous accomplishments. Furthermore, Harrison continued, this nomination sends the wrong message about accountability. Are we saying that failure in private sector management is a qualification for federal leadership? What precedent does this set for other nominees who might have similar issues in their background? The questioning was aggressive and pointed. Harrison's staff had clearly done their homework, presenting a detailed timeline of the financial decisions that had led to Rebecca's resignation. They questioned specific expenditures, challenged her explanations, and repeatedly asked why someone who had failed to follow federal grant requirements should be trusted with broader federal oversight. Rebecca's response: but Rebecca had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, even if she hadn't known it. Her responses were calm, detailed, and most importantly completely honest about her mistake. Senator Harrison, you're absolutely right that I failed to maintain the strict compliance standards required for federal grant recipients, she said. I take full responsibility for those failures, but I want to be clear about what those failures were and what they were not. She then methodically walked through each financial decision, explaining the reasoning behind expenditures that had been questioned, acknowledging where she had prioritized mission over compliance, and detailing the corrective measures that had been implemented. The truth is, Senator, I was so focused on helping veterans that I sometimes lost sight of the administrative requirements that came with federal funding. That was wrong, and I learned from it. But I want to ask you this: would you rather have someone in this position who has never made mistakes, or someone who has made mistakes, learned from them, and demonstrated over 20 years that they can grow and improve? The veteran testimony. The hearing's turning point came when Senator Martinez called for testimony from the veterans in the gallery. One by one they approached the witness table to share their stories of how Rebecca's organization had helped them. Master Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, who had served 3 tours in Iraq, testified about how Rebecca's advocacy had helped her secure disability benefits that had been denied for 8 years. Senators, I don't care about compliance reports or financial audits, she said, her voice breaking. I care about the fact that Rebecca Thompson saved my family's home when the VA wouldn't listen to us. Lieutenant Colonel James Washington, a Vietnam veteran, described how Rebecca's legal advocacy program had helped him upgrade his discharge status after 40 years of carrying the stigma of a less than honorable discharge due to PTSD. "She didn't just change my VA benefits," he said. "She gave me back my dignity." The testimonies continued for hours. Veteran after veteran shared stories of bureaucratic nightmares resolved, benefits secured, housing saved, and lives literally saved through Rebecca's intervention. By the end of the day, even Senator Harrison seemed moved by the overwhelming evidence of impact. The personal moment. During a recess, I approached Rebecca in the hallway outside the hearing room. She looked exhausted but determined, much like she had during the worst days following her resignation. "How are you holding up?" I asked. "You know, it's strange," she said. 20 years ago, when I was being questioned about my competence and character, I was terrified because I knew the criticisms were true. Today, I'm being questioned about my competence and character again, but I'm not afraid because I know who I've become." She paused, watching the veterans who had come to support her filling the hallway. "These people didn't travel from across the country because they think I'm perfect. They came because they know I'll fight for them, even when it's difficult, even when it costs me personally." The unexpected support. The hearing's most dramatic moment came when Senator Harrison called an unexpected witness, former President Adams, who had left office 2 years earlier but remained highly respected on both sides of the aisle. "Senators," the former president said, "I worked with Rebecca Thompson for 6 years during my administration. She was instrumental in developing the Veterans First initiative that expanded mental health services and reduced veteran homelessness by her financial management issues at her private organization, while regrettable, pale in comparison to her record of results in serving those who served us." He continued, "Leadership isn't about never making mistakes. Leadership is about learning from mistakes and using those lessons to serve others more effectively." Rebecca Thompson has demonstrated that kind of leadership for 20 years. The committee vote. After 3 days of hearings, the committee voted 14-4 to approve Rebecca's nomination, with even 2 Republican senators joining the Democratic majority. Senator Harrison, while maintaining his opposition, acknowledged in his closing remarks that he had been impressed by the testimony from veterans, and by Rebecca's forthright responses to difficult questions. "I still have concerns about the precedent this sets," he said, "but I cannot ignore the overwhelming evidence of Ms. Thompson's dedication to our veterans. I hope that if confirmed, she will bring the same passion to federal service that she brought to private advocacy, while maintaining the highest standards of compliance and accountability." The Senate floor. 2 weeks later, the full Senate voted 67-33 to confirm Rebecca as the nation's first special advocate for Veterans Affairs. The margin was larger than anyone had expected, reflecting the powerful impact of the veteran testimonies and Rebecca's honest handling of the confirmation process. I watched from the Senate gallery as Rebecca was sworn in by the Vice President, surrounded by the same veterans who had testified on her behalf. She had gone from the lowest point of her career to one of the highest positions in veterans advocacy in just 6 months. The new beginning. That evening, as we celebrated with family and friends at a quiet restaurant near the Capitol, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. "David, do you remember what you told me 20 years ago? That sometimes our worst moments become the foundation for our best chapters." I nodded, remembering that conversation in my chambers after her public humiliation. "I thought that was just something people said to make you feel better when you fail," she continued, "but it's actually true. Every failure, every mistake, every moment of public embarrassment, they all led to this, not just the position, but the person I had to become to be worthy of." As we raised our glasses in celebration, I realized that we were witnessing the completion of one of the most remarkable redemption stories in public service. But more than that, we were seeing proof that character, once forged in the fire of consequence and accountability, becomes unshakable, capable of withstanding any challenge and turning any setback into a setup for greater service. The first comprehensive report on Rebecca's performance as Special Advocate for Veterans Affairs landed on my desk on a Tuesday morning, 3 years after her confirmation. As a federal judge who often handled veterans' cases, I was on the distribution list for major policy reports, but I had requested this one for personal reasons. I wanted to see how my sister was doing in the most important job of her career. The numbers were staggering. Under Rebecca's leadership, the average processing time for disability claims had been reduced from 125 days to 43 days. The veteran homelessness rate had dropped by 52% nationally. Most remarkably, the veteran suicide rate, which had been rising for decades, had declined for 3 consecutive years for the first time since the Vietnam War. But statistics, impressive as they were, only told part of the stories. The real measure of Rebecca's impact was in the fundamental changes she had brought to how the federal government served those who had served their country. I learned about Rebecca's most significant achievement through an unexpected phone call from the president himself. President Sarah Chen, Judge Patricia Chen's daughter, who had been elected 2 years earlier, called my chambers personally to discuss an initiative Rebecca had proposed. "Judge Thompson, I wanted you to know that your sister has presented us with the most comprehensive veterans reform proposal in 40 years. The president said, "It's called the Veterans First Constitutional Amendment, and it would guarantee specific rights to veterans in the Constitution itself." The amendment Rebecca had drafted was revolution would establish constitutional rights to health care, housing assistance, education benefits, and legal representation for all veterans. More importantly, it would create a constitutional requirement that any reduction in veterans' benefits would require a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress, making it nearly impossible for future political winds to erode support for those who had served. "She's been working with congressional leaders from both parties," President Chen continued. "The preliminary support is unprecedented. We think we might actually be able to get this passed." But Rebecca's federal service hadn't come without personal sacrifice. During a quiet dinner at my home the following weekend, she confided in me about the toll her position was taking. "David, I love this work, but it's consuming me," she said, looking older than her 60 years. "I work 16-hour days, 7 days a week. I haven't taken a vacation in 3 years. I'm trying to solve problems that have existed for decades, and every day I go home knowing that there are veterans who needed help that we couldn't provide fast enough." My wife Ellen, ever perceptive, leaned forward. "Rebecca, you can't save everyone. You've already done more than anyone could have expected." "But that's just it," Rebecca replied. "I can see how much more needs to be done. The constitutional amendment is just the beginning. We need to completely reimagine how this country treats its veterans, and I feel like I'm running out of time." I understood what she meant. At 60, Rebecca was acutely aware that she might only have one more decade of peak professional energy. She was trying to accomplish in years what typically took generations. That understanding became even more urgent when Rebecca received devastating personal news. During a routine physical exam, doctors discovered early-stage pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis was caught early enough for treatment, but it meant months of chemotherapy and an uncertain prognosis. Rebecca called me from the hospital after receiving the diagnosis. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Anything," I said. "If I only have a few years left, and I'm not saying I do, but if I do, what should I focus on? What would have the most lasting impact?" It was the kind of question that cuts through all pretense and forces you to confront what really matters. I thought about our journey together, from that terrible night at the charity gala, through 25 years of transformation and service. "Rebecca, you've already built a legacy that will outlast you by generations. The programs you've created, the lives you've saved, the standards you've set, those will continue long after you're gone. But if you want to cement that legacy, focus on the constitutional amendment that could protect veterans for centuries." What followed was the most intensive legislative campaign in modern American history. Rebecca, despite undergoing chemotherapy treatments, traveled to all 50 states to build support for the Veterans First Amendment. She spoke at VFW halls, American Legion posts, and military bases. She testified before state legislatures and met with governors and mayors. The turning point came during a nationally televised address Rebecca gave from Walter Reed Medical Center between chemotherapy treatments. Looking directly into the camera, with her head covered by a scarf from her hair loss, she made the case for constitutional protection of veterans' rights. "I may not have much time left to serve in this position," she said, her voice strong despite her physical frailty. But I want to use whatever time I have to ensure that no future veteran has to fight the same battles for basic services that previous generations have fought. We send our young people to war with a promise that we'll take care of them when they come home. It's time to make that promise unbreakable. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Calls flooded congressional offices. State legislatures began passing resolutions supporting the amendment. Veterans organizations that had never agreed on anything came together in unanimous support. During one of Rebecca's hospital stays, I brought her a box of letters from veterans across the country who had heard about her illness and wanted to express their gratitude. We spent the afternoon reading them together, both of us crying at the stories of lives changed and hope restored. "You know what's funny?" Rebecca said, setting down a letter from a Marine who credited her advocacy with saving his marriage. 25 years ago, I thought success meant impressing people at cocktail parties and making partner at a prestigious law firm. Now I realize that real success is measured in letters like these. People whose lives are better because of work you'll never be credited for publicly. She picked up another letter, this one from a Gold Star mother whose son had been killed in Afghanistan. "My son died serving his country." The letter read, "Rebecca Thompson made sure he didn't die in vain by fighting for the veterans who came home. This is why we do it." Rebecca said quietly, "Not for the recognition or the titles, or the history book. We do it because someone has to, and we're privileged to be in a position where we can." 6 months into her treatment, Rebecca received news that surprised everyone. The cancer was in remission. Her oncologist, Williams, called it remarkable and attributed her recovery not just to the treatment, but to her sense of purpose and determination. "I've seen this before," Dr. Williams told us during a follow-up appointment. "Patients who have something meaningful to fight for often respond better to treatment. Your sister has been fighting for more than herself. She's been fighting for an entire generation of veterans." Rebecca smiled weakly but with genuine happiness. "Does this mean I get to see the constitutional amendment passed?" Dr. Williams nodded. "If you take care of yourself and don't overdo it, there's no reason you can't continue your work for many years to come." 18 months after Rebecca's diagnosis, the Veterans' First Constitutional Amendment passed both houses of Congress with the required 2/3 majority. The final vote in the Senate was 78-22. With support from both parties reflecting the extraordinary coalition Rebecca had built. I was in the Senate gallery when the final vote was tallied, watching my sister, bald from chemotherapy but radiant with joy, embrace senators from both parties who had supported the measure. It would still need to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, but the momentum was clearly unstoppable. As we left the Capitol that evening, Rebecca turned to me with tears in her eyes. "David, do you think Dad would be proud of us?" I thought about our father, a Vietnam veteran who had struggled with the VA system for decades before his death. "Rebecca, I think he's been proud of you every day for the past 25 years. This just makes it official." The constitutional amendment that began with Rebecca's near-death experience was now on its way to becoming the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. A permanent guarantee that America would keep its promises to those who serve. The ratification process for the Veterans' First Constitutional Amendment became a masterclass in grassroots organizing and bipartisan cooperation. Rebecca, now in her second year of cancer remission but still dealing with the lingering effects of treatment, traveled tirelessly from state to state, building the coalition needed to secure approval from 38 state legislatures. What made this campaign different from typical political efforts was its deeply personal nature. Rather than relying on political rhetoric or partisan appeals, Rebecca focused on individual stories: veterans who had been failed by the system, families who had lost loved ones to suicide or homelessness, communities that had rallied to support their returning heroes. In Wyoming, she spoke at a town hall where the entire population seemed to be related to someone who had served. In California, she addressed a gathering of tech workers who were veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. In Mississippi, she sat on the porch of a 95-year-old World War II veteran who had been fighting for benefits for 70 years. Each state has been unique, Rebecca told me during one of our weekly phone calls. But the underlying story is always the same. People who served their country with honor who then had to fight another war just to get the help they were promised. Not everyone supported the amendment. A small but vocal group of fiscal conservatives argued that constitutionally guaranteeing veterans' benefits would create an unsustainable financial burden. Some legal scholars worried about the precedent of embedding specific policy promises in the Constitution. The most serious challenge came from Senator Harrison, the same senator who had opposed Rebecca's confirmation 3 years earlier. Now facing re-election in a state with a large veteran population, he found himself in the awkward position of opposing an amendment that had overwhelming public support. "I respect our veterans," Harrison said during a debate with his challenger, "but we cannot mortgage our children's future by making promises in the Constitution that we may not be able to keep. This amendment is well-intentioned but fiscally irresponsible." His opponent, a Iraq War veteran named Captain Jessica Martinez, the same Jessica who had approached me at the law firm dinner years earlier, responded with devastating effectiveness. "Senator Harrison, when you sent us to war, you didn't worry about the cost. When you asked us to risk our lives, you didn't put conditions on your gratitude. Why are you putting conditions on it now?" Despite her public success, Rebecca was struggling privately with the physical and emotional demands of the ratification campaign. During a visit to my home in late spring, she confided her deepest fears. "David, I'm exhausted. Not just physically but emotionally. Every day I meet veterans who are struggling, families who are broken, people who trusted the system and were betrayed. Sometimes I feel like I'm trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon." My wife Ellen, now in her 70s but still practicing nursing part-time, examined Rebecca with the practiced eye of someone who had seen countless patients. "You need to rest," she said bluntly. "Your body is still recovering from cancer treatment, and you're pushing it beyond its limits." But Rebecca couldn't rest. The ratification process had momentum, and she knew that if it stalled, it might never recover. "I'll rest when the 38th state votes yes," "I've come too far to stop now." The turning point came in an unexpected place: Senator Harrison's home state of Montana. Rebecca had been invited to speak at the state capitol by the Montana Veterans Coalition, a nonpartisan group that included Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and progressives, all united by their military service. The hearing was supposed to be routine testimony before the state legislature's Judiciary Committee, but when Rebecca took the podium, something extraordinary happened. She set aside her prepared remarks and spoke directly from the heart about why the amendment mattered. "Legislators, I'm not here to give you statistics or policy arguments," she began. "I'm here to tell you about my father. He served 2 tours in Vietnam, came home to a country that didn't want him, and spent 40 years fighting for benefits he'd been promised. He died still fighting." She paused, visibly emotional. "This amendment isn't about politics or budgets or constitutional theory. It's about keeping a promise. It's about saying that when we send our children to war, we'll take care of them when they come home. It's about making that promise so sacred that no future politician can break it for convenience or expediency." The committee voted unanimously to recommend ratification. When the full Montana legislature voted 2 weeks later, it passed 47-3, with even Senator Harrison's closest allies supporting it. Montana's overwhelming approval triggered a cascade of state ratifications. Within 6 months, 35 states had approved the amendment. The momentum was undeniable, and even previously reluctant states began moving toward approval. The 37th state was Texas, where Governor Martinez, Jessica's older brother, signed the ratification into law at a ceremony attended by thousands of veterans. Today, Texas joins the growing movement to make America's promise to its veterans unbreakable, he declared. That left just one more state needed for ratification. The honor would go to Ohio, Rebecca and my home state, where our parents had raised us and where our father had struggled with the VA system that Rebecca was now transforming. The Ohio ratification ceremony was scheduled for Veterans Day, exactly 26 years after the charity gala incident that had changed both our lives forever. The Ohio State House was packed with veterans from across the state, many of whom had traveled hundreds of miles to witness this historic moment. Governor Thompson, no relation despite the shared name, had invited both Rebecca and me to speak at the ceremony. As we sat on the platform waiting for the formal vote, Rebecca grabbed my hand. "David, I need to tell you something," she whispered. The cancer is back. The doctors found new tumors last week. I haven't told anyone else yet. My heart sank, but before I could respond, she continued. But that's not what matters right now. What matters is that in a few minutes, the promise we make to veterans will be written into the Constitution forever. My father's sacrifice will be on. Every veteran who comes after will have protections that can't be taken away by politics or budget cuts. When the Ohio legislature voted 181-18 to ratify the veterans' first constitutional amendment, making it the 28th Amendment to the Constitution, the State House erupted in celebration. Veterans who had fought in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan embraced each other and wept openly. Rebecca was invited to make remarks as the ceremony concluded. Walking slowly to the podium, the effects of her renewed cancer battle already beginning to show, she looked out at the crowd of veterans and their families. 26 years ago, I was a different person, she began. I was arrogant, selfish, and dismissive of the sacrifices others had made. I mocked the very people I now have the honor to serve. She paused, looking directly at me. But my brother taught me something that changed my life. He taught me that character isn't about being perfect. It's about how you respond when you fail. It's about choosing to become better rather than bitter. Her voice strengthened as she continued. Today, we've made a promise that will outlast all of us, no matter what political winds blow, no matter what economic pressures arise. America will keep its commitment to those who serve. That promise is now written in the Constitution itself, as permanent as the Bill of Rights. After the ceremony, as crowds celebrated in the streets and news anchors provided commentary about the historic achievement, Rebecca and I found ourselves alone in the empty rotunda of the Ohio State House. Do you remember what you told me after the charity gala? She asked. That sometimes our worst moments become the foundation for our best chapters. I nodded, remembering that conversation in my chambers 26 years earlier. I used to think that was just something people said to make you feel better when you failed, she continued. But it's actually the most profound truth I've ever learned. That night of humiliation became the foundation for everything meaningful I've accomplished since. As we walked out of the State House together past the bronze plaques commemorating Ohio's war heroes, I realized that we were witnessing the completion of one of the most remarkable personal and professional transformations in American history. But more than that, we were seeing proof that individual redemption, when genuine and sustained, can become a force for historic change that benefits millions of people for generations to come. 2 years later, the final chapter, the call came at dawn on a crisp October morning, exactly 28 years after the charity gala that had changed everything. Rebecca's doctor, speaking in the gentle tone reserved for the most difficult conversations, informed me that my sister had perhaps days, not weeks, remaining. I found her in the hospice room she had specifically requested, one overlooking the National Cemetery where our father was buried. Despite the ravages of her illness, her eyes still held the fierce intelligence and compassion that had driven her for nearly 3 decades of service. David, she said, her voice weak but clear, I need to tell you the most important thing I've learned. I pulled my chair closer, knowing that whatever she was about to share would be her final gift to me and to the world. That night at the charity gala, when I humiliated you in front of everyone, I thought I was demonstrating my superiority. I thought I was showing the world how successful I was compared to my brother who had settled for helping people instead of chasing prestige. She paused, gathering strength, but what I was actually doing was revealing my complete ignorance about what success really means. You see, I thought success was about what you could get from the world. It took me 28 years to understand that success is about what you can give to the world. The hospital gathering. Over the next 2 days, Rebecca's hospice room became an informal pilgrimage site. Veterans from across the country, many whom she had never met personally, but whose lives had been touched by her work, came to pay their respect. They filled the hallways, the parking lot, and the nearby streets, creating an impromptu honor guard for someone who had dedicated her life to serving them. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, now in her 70s, sat by Rebecca's bedside for hours, holding her hand and sharing stories of the grandchildren she had been able to raise because Rebecca's advocacy had secured her disability benefits. You gave me my life back, she whispered. How do I thank someone for that? Lieutenant Colonel Washington, the Vietnam veteran whose discharge status Rebecca had helped upgrade decades earlier, traveled from California despite his own failing health. "I carried shame for 40 years," he told her. "You didn't just change my benefits, you gave me back my honor." The president's visit. On Rebecca's final day, President Sarah Chen made an unprecedented personal visit to the hospital. Accompanied only by her Secret Service detail, she came not as a political figure but as the daughter of a judge who had watched Rebecca's transformation unfold over nearly 3 decades. "Rebecca, I want you to know that the Veterans' First Amendment you championed has already changed over 2 million lives," the president said, sitting beside her bed. "The suicide prevention programs you insisted we fund have saved an estimated 15,000 lives in just the past 2 years." Rebecca smiled weakly. "Numbers are important, but they're not the real measure. The real measure is in the individual stories, the veteran who gets help instead of being turned away, the family that stays together instead of being torn apart by war's aftermath, the young service member who gets a second chance instead of a life sentence of struggle." The final conversation. As evening approached and Rebecca's breathing became more labored, she asked to speak privately with me one last time. The room was cleared of visitors, leaving just the two of us, the siblings whose journey together had spanned nearly 6 decades. "David, I need you to promise me something," she said, each word requiring enormous effort. "Anything, promise me that you'll continue to tell our story, not because it's about us, but because it proves something that people desperately need to believe, that it's never too late to change, that our worst moments don't have to define us, that character isn't something you're born with, it's something you choose to build, day after day, decision after decision." I promised, though the words came through tears. "And promise me something else," she continued. "Promise me that you'll tell people that real success, the kind that matters, the kind that lasts, isn't about impressing others, it's about serving others. It's not about what you achieve for yourself, it's about what you make possible for people you'll never meet." The moment of truth. As Rebecca's breathing grew shallower, she made one final effort to speak. "David, that night at the charity gala, I thought I was destroying you, but what I was actually doing was setting both of us free. Free from the illusion that external success matters more than internal character. Free from the lie that what others think of us is more important than what we do for others." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "The greatest irony of my life is that the moment I thought I was demonstrating my superiority was actually the moment that taught me what true greatness looks like. True greatness is what you showed that night. The grace to let someone face the consequences of their choices while leaving the door open for redemption." The legacy continues. Rebecca passed away peacefully at sunset, surrounded by the sounds of veterans maintaining their vigil in the hallway outside. Her funeral became a celebration not just of her life but of the fundamental values she had embodied: accountability, service, humility, and the unshakable belief that people can change. The Veterans' First Constitutional Amendment was officially renamed the Rebecca Thompson Veterans' Rights Amendment, in a unanimous congressional resolution, but more importantly, the principles she had lived by continued to ripple outward through the countless lives she had touched. The eternal lesson. 6 months after Rebecca's death, I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the annual gathering of the American Bar Association, the same organization that had once used our story as a cautionary tale about professional conduct. Now, nearly 3 decades later, they wanted me to speak about redemption, character, and the power of second chances. Standing before an audience of 3,000 attorneys, I shared the complete story of that night at the charity gala, and everything that followed. But I concluded with the lesson that Rebecca had spent her final days ensuring I understood. Ladies and gentlemen, my sister's greatest achievement wasn't the constitutional amendment that will protect veterans for centuries. It wasn't the billions in benefits she helped secure or the thousands of lives she saved. Her greatest achievement was proving that character is not fixed, that we all have the power to become better than our worst moment. I paused, looking out at the sea of faces, young attorneys just starting their careers, seasoned practitioners, looking for renewed purpose, judges and legislators, and advocates all searching for meaning in their work. The legal profession teaches us about justice, about accountability, about consequences, but Rebecca's life taught me something even more important, that the highest form of justice is the kind that creates space for redemption,
that true accountability includes the possibility of growth, that the most meaningful consequences are the ones that transform us rather than simply punish us. The final message. So I leave you with this challenge. I conclude, whatever mistakes you've made, whatever failures you carry, whatever moments of poor judgment haunt you, they don't have to be your final story. Character isn't about perfection. Character is about what you choose to do after you fail. My sister spent 28 years proving that our worst moments can become the foundation for our greatest contribution. She showed that genuine remorse, sustained effort, and unwavering commitment to serving others can transform not just individual lives, but entire institutions, and even constitutional law itself. The question isn't whether you'll face moments that test your character. You will. The question is whether you'll use those moments as excuses to give up, or as opportunities to grow, whether you'll let failure define you, or refine you, whether you'll choose bitterness, or choose to become better. As I left the podium that day, I carried with me the knowledge that Rebecca's transformation had become more than a personal redemption story. It had become proof of humanity's greatest truth, that as long as we draw breath, we have the power to change, to grow, to become more than we were, that no mistake is permanent, unless we choose to make it so, and that the most profound impact we can have on the world isn't about achieving personal success, it's about using our lives, our failures, our growth, and our character to make it possible for others to believe in their own capacity for transformation. 28 years after a moment of public humiliation, Rebecca had left the world a more hopeful place, not because she had achieved greatness, but because she had proven that greatness is always within reach, for anyone willing to choose character over comfort, service over self-interest, and growth over grudges. That is her eternal legacy. That is the lesson that will outlive us all. That is why her story matters, not because it's unique, but because it's possible for anyone, at any time, starting right now.
You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.